What we casually refer to as a black box in an automobile is actually the ACM, which stands for Airbag Control Module, or the EDR, which stands for Event Data Recorder. The term black box was borrowed from the aviation industry as flight data recorders became famous for having really important information for investigators when they wanted to figure out what went wrong on a plane. However, there is little else in common between airplane and automotive black boxes. Here's some black boxes that can be found inside the cars, SUVs, minivans, and pickup trucks that you and I drive. As you can see, they're not always black, and oftentimes they differ in appearance and size. Now, something that's really important to know about automobile black boxes is that they're not inside the vehicle constantly recording everything that's happening in transit, the same way that an airplane flight data recorder does. In fact, the primary function of the black box is to sense forces and accelerations and decide whether or not to deploy airbags. That's it. That's what the ACM's job actually is. And they do a pretty good job of sensing accelerations and deploying airbags within milliseconds when needed. Permanently recording every single thing that's going on was just not how automotive black boxes were set up to work. Now, we're usually interested in the black box's contents when there's a claim of an incident. So it is useful that is when the black box goes beyond sensing and begins to record information, usually 5 seconds before an event. The ability to give us a glimpse just a few seconds before a crash is why the ACM is oftentimes called the black box. The only time a black box records anything to its internal memory is when it senses higher than normal, typical, everyday forces and accelerations. So there are two primary events that a black box records: deployment event and non-deployment event. So let's first talk about deployment events, since they're a little bit more straightforward. When the black box senses higher than normal accelerations and decides to deploy an airbag, that's when it records what we call a deployment event. This event, along with a snapshot of data such as speed, brake application, and throttle use, a few seconds before the airbag went off, would have been recorded and permanently locked into the black box's memory. Anytime an airbag has gone off in a vehicle, there's an extremely high chance that the black box will have some sort of information about what happened right before the airbags went off. The great thing about deployment events is that they cannot be overwritten. Now, there are of course situations where minor collisions occur and airbags don't go off. And just because this happens doesn't mean there is no information to be gleaned off a black box. Black boxes record something that's called a non-deployment event. And these are a little bit more volatile, however, they can still provide really useful information. So a black box records a non-deployment event when the vehicle experiences higher than normal accelerations that's sufficient enough to wake up the black box, but not severe enough to warrant the deployment of an airbag. Examples of where we commonly see non-deployment events being recorded by black boxes are minor fender benders in parking lots, or even if you were to run over a nasty pothole on the road. Like the deployment events we just covered, non-deployment events record some data a few seconds before the event occurred. But what's crucial to know about non-deployment events is that their data is volatile and it can be overwritten. There are generally two situations where a non-deployment event can vanish from a black box. Number one, when another event is recorded and overwrites it, or number two, after a certain number of key cycles. There are exceptions to this rule, but the general takeaway is that non-deployment events are extremely vulnerable to being cleared if they are not swiftly preserved after the collision in question. Okay, so now that you understand deployment and non-deployment events, it's now time to get into the information that everybody really wants to know. What kind of information can be found on a black box when an event has been recorded? First of all, the manufacturer has to have allowed us to access black box information just to see what's inside. Thankfully, the last few years, we've seen the vast majority of automakers offer support for black box imaging. So as you can see in the image, GM really led the way in the mid-90s. You fast forward a few years to the early 2000 to mid-2000, the other American manufacturers, as well as Toyota, came on board. And then in 2010, you see this huge push of all the other manufacturers coming on board, including Mazda, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Honda, and others. As for the type of information that we can get from supported vehicles, it varies greatly based on year, make, and model of the vehicle. But here's what we can usually get from a typical black box: speed, speed change, brake and throttle use, and seatbelt use. Newer vehicles can record even more specific information, such as individual wheel speeds, tire pressures, odometer readings, gear position, VIN number, and steering input. The general trend of newer vehicles is to record more and more information. And in the future, we expect black boxes to record more types of information, more time leading up to impact, and even more events. Nevertheless, it'll take some time for these newer, high-tech vehicles to become the majority on the roadway. Retrieving the information that is stored in a black box is usually called downloading or imaging the black box. It involves retrieving a copy of the electronic data that is stored on it, and when done properly by a trained EDR operator, the data on the black box should not be spoiled or cleared in any way. There are 4 different ways that an expert can get data when preserving evidence from a black box. The first method involves the expert physically going to the vehicle and setting up what is called a DLC download through the OBD2 port. DLC is the name of the type of cable used, and the OBD stands for Onboard Diagnostics. OBD systems give technicians access to various vehicle subsystems, including the black box. This DLC to OBD method requires that the black box has a power supply. However, what if the electrical system is shot and the vehicle is not a write-off? Our clients would not want us to disassemble the interior of the vehicle to get to the black box, so we have to figure out other methods. The DLC backpowering method involves supplying power to the vehicle's fuse box, which allows us to get power to the black box and download a copy of the data on it through the OBD2 port. This method is more complex and time-consuming and requires more specialized equipment, so we only resort to it if we cannot do the next direct-to-module download. The direct-to-module download involves plugging into the black box directly to supply power and download it. Since the black box is usually located under the driver's seat or under the center console, we usually have to cut through the carpet and disassemble some components to get to it. If the vehicle has no power and will be written off anyways, this is usually the method of choice. We will also physically remove the black box from the vehicle and keep it as evidence. The last method is called a desktop or bench download, and that's when we download the data from a workstation in our office. Desktop downloads are done when the black box was removed by the police or some other party, and we have been supplied with it and asked to access the data. Now we're going to start looking into a few case examples where you're going to get a chance to see what some of this data looks like. In our casework, we often utilize black box data to answer various types of questions like, was this really a hit and run? Was there an occupant seated in the front passenger seat? Were the occupants wearing their seatbelts? What steering inputs were there before the collision? Were the brakes applied? Was the vehicle speeding? Whether if you're on for the defense or the plaintiff side, and whether it's a PD or an AB or a BI claim, the data that's found in the black box can help provide a lot of insight into a collision in question. So let's start off with a relatively straightforward example. Our client received a case where all claimants reported a collision within a stop sign controlled intersection, where a BMW ran a stop sign and was T-boned by a Buick. The involved parties estimated that the Buick was traveling through at about 45 to 50 kilometers an hour at impact, and several people reported being injured in this collision. But the insurer felt that something was amiss and asked us to check out the vehicle and also look at the black box. As soon as we looked at the physical damage of the vehicles, we could see right away evidence that they did come in contact, however, not as reported. The damage on the BMW indicated that it was stationary when it was struck by the Buick. When we looked at the Buick's black box, more detailed information was revealed. Here's a table that summarizes some of the key black box data from the Buick. Notice how 5 seconds before impact, the Buick was stopped. Its speed was 0, and the brakes were on. At 4 seconds before impact, the driver's foot comes off the brake for 2 seconds, and the vehicle accelerates up to a speed of 20.9 kilometers per hour. 2 seconds before impact, the brakes are applied to slow down the vehicle slightly. This evidence clearly contradicts the story that the Buick was traveling through at 50 kilometers per hour when the BMW ran the stop sign. What really happened was that the BMW was stopped and the Buick accelerated from a complete stop to a maximum speed of about 21 kilometers per hour, braked for about 2 seconds, and then struck the BMW's right side. In this particular case, the black box was a smoking gun, and the data was used in court to ultimately show that this claim was fraudulent. Now I want to discuss an example that demonstrates why black box data should be used with caution and understood in context of all other available evidence. This case involves 3 vehicles and unfortunately 2 fatalities. The police arrived on site and documented the final arrest positions to be something like this. There was a white coupe and a black SUV in snowbanks on either side of the road, and a badly wrecked red sedan with extensive frontal and rear damage was lying in the middle of the roadway. So what happened here? Experts were brought into litigation on the case to analyze the evidence, which included the black box of the black SUV. Here's what it recorded. The SUV's speed 5 seconds before the event was 89 kilometers per hour. 1 second before the event was 39 kilometers per hour. The SUV was braking during the 5 seconds before the recorded event. The speed change experienced by the SUV was recorded as only negative 0.02 kilometers per hour. Another expert used this black box data to argue that the red sedan must have crossed over the center line and collided with the oncoming coupe first, was pushed back into its original lane, and then was struck by the black SUV from behind. We conducted a complete traditional reconstruction using the principles of conservation of energy, momentum, and computer simulations. The sequence of events that we came up with were as follows. A large black SUV rear ends a small red sedan. The red sedan goes into oncoming traffic and is struck by a white coupe. The black SUV and the white coupe each go into the snowbank on their side of the road. Our analysis determined that the SUV's impact speed when it struck the sedan to be between 104 to 114 kilometers per hour. We also estimated the SUV's speed change from the collision with the sedan to have been 15 to 25 kilometers an hour based on the damage exhibited by both vehicles. But as already noted, the black box recorded a pre-impact speed of 39 kilometers per hour and a speed change of only 0.02 kilometers per hour. So which is wrong, our analysis or the black box data? This is a trick question, and the answer is neither is wrong. So how can we explain why the impact speed that we calculated was nearly double the impact speed that was recorded by the black box? The SUV's black box data was found to be unrelated to the collision with the red sedan. Instead, the black box data was related to the collision of the SUV with the snowbank. How do we know this with certainty? First, the black box of the involved SUV could only hold one non-deployment event. Since that particular vehicle's black box only had one data slot, it would have overwritten any information in that slot should there be any other non-deployment event, even if the severity of the second event is less. In this case, the event where the SUV struck the sedan was likely recorded to the black box, but then the data was overwritten by the SUV's less severe collision with the snowbank. We also confirmed the sequence of events by using the black box's recorded speeds for the 5 seconds before the event to mathematically calculate the distance of the vehicle traveled, which added up to be exactly the distance between the impact with the sedan and final rest position in the snowbank, which was measured by the police at the scene. Therefore, the speed of 89 kilometers per hour at 5 seconds before the event represented the speed of the SUV just after impact with the sedan. The collision with the sedan would have abruptly slowed down the SUV's speed from 104 to 114 kilometers an hour at impact to about 89 kilometers an hour immediately after impact. It would be convenient if the black box held all the answers, but it's still just one piece of the puzzle. Relying solely on black box data and neglecting to analyze it in the context of all other available evidence can lead to gross misinterpretations of what actually happened in a collision. Our expertise helped us realize that the black box wasn't wrong. It was simply recording data about an event other than the one of most interest. Nevertheless, the information that it did contain helped us defend our opinion in court and was an integral part in reconstructing the main collision. So in conclusion, we've seen that black boxes can provide you with a wealth of information and great insight into how a collision actually occurred. When used correctly, black boxes allow for reconstructions with greater detail and higher certainty. But ultimately, they are still just one tool in a reconstructionist toolkit. So remember, the data contained inside a black box always needs to be examined with other physical evidence so that it puts it into context and then we can understand what it really means. We hope you found this video educational and informative. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send us an email anytime at this address.